Tech Sideline is presented by First Bank and Trust Company. They offer free checking with industry-leading mobile banking. Who you choose to bank with can make all the difference. Visit firstbank.com to learn more. Welcome in, Hokies fans, to this week's edition of the Tech Sideline podcast. We got everybody on set. We're talking football, baseball, softball, and so much more. It's all coming up on episode 298 of the Tech Sideline podcast, which starts right now. We record on Wednesday, May 22nd, 2023, from our high-tech studio at the Virginia Tech Corporate Research Center right here in Blacksburg, Virginia. We welcome you in, whether you are listening on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you consume your podcast, or if you're watching on YouTube. If you do happen to be on YouTube, make sure to like and subscribe while you're there, and also turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any future TSL content. Tech Sideline is presented by First Bank and Trust Company. First Bank and Trust Company is the bank that puts you first. Visit www.firstbank.com to learn more. We are also pleased to welcome a new sponsor to Tech Sideline and to the podcast, Coldwell Banker Townside Realtors in Blacksburg. Look for their ads promoting Realtors Tom Spruill, Mike Eggleston, and Bill Aiden, the Berry Ridge Project, in the coming weeks and months. If you know Coldwell Banker folks, tell them that you saw them on Tech Sideline and thank them for their support at TSL. All right, let's go ahead and get our introductions underway here. To my right, lead analyst and columnist Chris Coleman. Welcome back from your trip, Chris. Good to have you back. Across the way, senior staff writer Andy Bitter. Behind the scenes producing this afternoon, founder and general manager Will Stewart. And in the fourth chair, managing editor David Cunningham. Sorry, D. Cunningham. I'm your host, Giovanni Heater, and let's get right into it. First and foremost, another new hire here on the football staff, James Johnson. His official title is the Director of High School Relations. What does his role entail, and what are your thoughts on this addition?
So Tech now has two Director of High School Relations, assuming they don't move Farabee to a different role or something like that. It's just pretty much exactly like the title says, I guess. And I'm sure that's part of what he does, but I'm sure there's organizational things, helping set up visits and things like that behind the scenes. It's not a job that you have to be a football coach to do. If that was the case, if you had to be a football coach to do a lot of these recruiting jobs, then you look at these staffs across the country, and most of these guys have never been coaches before that are in the support staff position. So it doesn't matter that James Johnson is a former basketball coach. In fact, I would rather have him in that role than some random person right out of college that gets hired into these roles. Is like what happens in a lot of programs. So it's just another body, so to speak, and it's about keeping up relations and treating people well and things like that. Things that James Johnson's really good at. So I think the hiring is fine from that standpoint. I know a lot of people, I was overseas when it happened, but I could see some of the reactions, and people are like, why are we hiring a basketball coach? I'm like, well, we're not hiring him to coach. We're just hiring him to be nice to people and organize and recruit. Those are the things he was good at when he was at Virginia Tech. He was an excellent recruiter, and nobody ever had an ill word to say about him. So it's a fine hire from that standpoint. How much it moves the needle, though, either way, positive or negative, like it's not going to have a negative effect because he used to be a basketball coach. That's what some people were saying when it first happened, and that's not the case. But it's not going to Tech's not going to start signing 4 or 5 star recruits because of it either.
Have you ever seen anything like that, though, where you hire a former men's basketball coach to be on the football recruiting staff, essentially? I mean, that's wild.
Yeah, the Florida State Director of High School Relations is the former lead writer for 2-7 Sports Recruiting, a guy who's never coached before.
Wow.
He literally just covered recruiting. So they hired him because he knew a bunch of high school coaches.
Well, I think Vanderbilt did something similar. Was it Barton Simmons?
Mm-hmm.
I think he was at Vanderbilt. They hired him as recruiting staff. I don't know. We see some unusual hires like that. I don't think we've ever seen a former head men's basketball coach come back to the school that fired him under the athletic director that fired him and work for this program. I think it sort of speaks to James Johnson's relationship with Virginia Tech. He clearly loves the school still. He loves the area still. I think he loves the people that he's working with here. I thought it was interesting, when the hire was made, I was like you, I saw a lot of the reactions. I'm like, they didn't hire him to be the offensive coordinator. Like in that case, I'd be like, no, that is a bad. What is Brent Pry doing? This is the second director of high school relations. I guess that makes two directors of high school relations. It's like attorneys general. You got to pluralize the first one there. This is not going to make or break the program. This is a guy who's going to sell Virginia Tech. That's what he does. He's going to sell recruits and their families on Virginia Tech, and he's done that for a long time here. And I really don't see the downside to this addition. I think it can be a good one.
Would you have rathered somebody that, like you were just mentioning with the 247 guy, maybe is more integrated into the high school football community? Because as a former college basketball coach, yeah, you might have relationships with high school basketball, but as far as the football side, might be something new.
James Johnson's not going to have any issues forming relationships. I mean, there are very few people in this world that would come back to work at the place that fired them, right? So he's a guy, he does not have a big ego. He's easy to communicate with. He came to one of our spring game tailgates one time back when he was the head coach at Virginia Tech, right? So I think Virginia Tech is going to recruit at Virginia Tech's level. And I think it's important to have people on the staff who know Virginia Tech and can sell Virginia Tech to Virginia Tech type people.
And if they want somebody with a football background, they have Glenwood Fairby already in that role.
Right.
This is just, for the longest time, Virginia Tech fans have wanted more and more staffers in their recruiting department, and here they get one. And a lot of the complaints are like, well, this guy doesn't fit this exact box. I think he's a guy that knows how to do the type of things they're going to ask him to do, and he'll grow into the role. And as Brent Price said after they made the hire, he wants it to James to kind of fill the role out as he sees fit and grow into it and make it veer off in different directions that they maybe don't know right now. So I think it's an interesting hire. Like I said, I don't think it's going to make or break the program here. It's a director of high school relations position, but somebody who knows VT, that sells VT, that loves VT, you're not going to find somebody much better than James Johnson.
If you recall, he was at the signing day ceremony.
He was,
Tech, back in December.
He built a balloon arch.
Right.
Or should I say he birthed it. Any Brooklyn Nine-Nine listeners out there would understand that reference. It was unusual to see him there. It's like, okay, that makes a little bit more sense. Very good friends with Michael Hazel, the chief of staff on the football staff.
Absolutely. And I was talking to someone that day, and the general consensus was at Virginia Tech, we'd like to find James Johnson a job because we think he can be a benefit. We just have to find a spot for him. So this has been in the works for a while.
Yeah, so I listened to Evan Hughes' Hokie Insider podcast last week, I believe. He sat down with James Johnson. It was a really, really good interview, about 45, 50 minutes. And one of the things that stood out to me about just JJ coming back, this is a guy who has been on multiple basketball staffs. He was at NC State most recently under Kevin Keats. Then he took a break for a year from basketball. He's close with Jim Larinaga. He was on his staff that went to the Final Four at George Mason. But the way Johnson described it was, and this is a guy who was raised in Powhatan, right outside of Richmond. He went to Ferrum. He has big ties to the state. He's ties to Carolina. He knows the area. He knows the footprint, if that's what you want to describe it as, right? He's a guy who's familiar with it. And Gio, you brought up, well, if he's a football coach or he's a former basketball coach, how will he gel with the football side? Something Johnson mentioned on the podcast with Evan was that when you go to a lot of these high schools in the Commonwealth or even in North Carolina, there are a lot of times where when you go to recruit a kid, you're talking to the principal and you're talking to some of his teachers and you're talking to some of the people that are just around him every day, right? And that might be the gym teacher who is the football coach, right? So in a lot of places, he said that relationship, talking with people on the football side and basketball side, as far as that part of high school recruiting goes, it's pretty natural. So, yeah, and he also talked about how much he loves Virginia Tech and coming back. And, I think my reaction was probably the same as everybody else. It's like, James Johnson's coming back to be on the football staff, but he mentioned how close he is with Michael Hazel. They worked together at Elon back in the early 2000s, and they've formed a really, really tight relationship. And if that's somebody that Brent Pry thinks can help grow Virginia Tech's relationships, I think it's not going to hurt anything, like Chris said.
Well, we're going to throw it a bone here. The whole conference realignment buzz, and of course everybody goes nuts on Twitter, and the ACC meeting sparked a little something. Talks of revenue distribution, talks of the 7, right? And Virginia Tech was included in that 7. It was like Clemson, Florida State, Miami, all the big dogs, and then it felt like Virginia Tech. That's the half you'd want to be on, but just kind of your thoughts on the whole thing as we throw that a bone and unpack it a little bit, because there's not a ton of substance to it. But
I think every summer something pops up when it comes to realignment or expansion or whatever. And it kind of takes you by surprise. Like, obviously, during ACC Media Day was when we found out about the last round of the SEC expansion, right?
Texas, Oklahoma.
And then the USC Oregon stuff, I think was a year later over the summer. Yeah, you're right. So I don't. I didn't necessarily see it coming, but I also didn't. I was overseas, and I didn't realize the ACC meetings were actually going on. For the most part, I think it's kind of much ado about nothing. I mean, I would expect every school, whether they're in the Magnificent Seven or not, to do their due diligence on the grant of rights for the ACC and everything like that, and whether you can get out of them. Because, like, even if I wasn't looking to leave, I would want to know whether those other schools could leave or not. So everybody's doing their due diligence on that. But the fact of the matter is, it just seems like those grant of rights are pretty unbreakable, which means nothing's going to happen for at least a decade, most likely, unless something in the landscape drastically changes. I mean, it's like you wrote in your article, Andy. I mean, there's a reason those schools don't pack up and leave immediately to go to the SEC. They have to wait for their grant of rights to run out so they don't have to give all that money back to their old conference. And it's the same thing for the ACC. Depending on where you could land if you left the ACC, I guess that kind of helps shape your views of the grant of rights. Like, if you're Clemson and Florida State and you're going to be fine no matter what, and you're going to have a soft landing spot, then you probably hate them. But for other schools where you don't know where you would end up if the ACC fell apart, you're probably happy that the grant of rights exists because it's holding the conference together. So it just depends on your point of view. But I don't think anything's going to, I know everybody wants to know what's going to happen with that. Good or bad, you want to know now or as soon as possible and get it out of the way. But just the way that's written, and it just doesn't seem like you can get out of something like that. And so I don't think that situation is going to be resolved for quite a long time. So I think most of the stuff that pops up in the summer, it might pop up again next summer where they're talking about something. But it's just the off season and there's nothing else to talk about. So I just don't think anything's going to change for quite a while.
It seemed like a lot of bluster in an effort to raise awareness about this and have some leverage going into the ACC meetings to get this unequal revenue split that they're doing. I know Whit Babcock has said several times when he's spoken to the media about coaching hires, every leak has a motive. It felt like that was the motive of this leak, was to rile up some, energy here going into this thing, perhaps have a little bit of leverage on your side. It sounds like there was some airing of grievances at the spring meetings, which is, maybe that's just what this league needed, was a little open counseling here, get it out on the table there. But it seems like a lot of noise about something that typically has happened very quietly in terms of expansion. 2 years ago, UCLA and USC to the Big Ten. No, I'm reversing them. Oklahoma and Texas, the Big 12, or to the SEC 2 years ago, kind of happened out of nowhere. I know there was a leak to it was like a Texas A&M reporter. So somehow they got a hold of it and tried to stop the whole thing from happening. But it was pretty quiet up until it had happened. UCLA and USC going to the Big Ten. It was pretty quiet until it happened. People don't normally telegraph these things coming. If it's going to happen, it would have happened. So that tells me that they don't quite have the legal standing or the votes necessary to break up the ACC or get out of this grant of rights, because if they did, I think they would have done it by now. They wouldn't be sitting here talking about doing it. They would have done it. That's the action that happens usually in these conference realignment scenarios. So I think it was a lot of talk for the moment. I'm not going to say the ACC is on safe footing or anything like that, but they wanted to go into this. They wanted to get an unequal revenue split. It sounds like the ACC is moving in that direction. So I guess mission accomplished from that standpoint. But I am a little skeptical of, hey, the ACC is going to fall apart tomorrow. I just don't think they have the votes. I don't know if they have the legal standing to do that. I don't know if there are enough spots in new leagues if all these schools were to be on the open market. I mean, is the Big Ten necessarily going to gobble up 4 of them and the SEC 4 of them? Oregon and Washington, it was reported the Big Ten commissioner, the previous one, Warren, wanted to add them and went to the TV partners, and the TV partners are like, it's not enough money. We're not going to pay, you have to make everybody whole. So you're talking $150 million for the 2 of those schools on top of your existing TV contract. Like, which schools are moving the needle this much right now, other than Notre Dame, who's not going into a conference, by the way? It's getting to the point where I don't know if these schools that are going to these leagues would necessarily add enough revenue on top of the existing revenue to make it worth it to expand. So that's me throwing a lot of cold water on what I think is maybe something that's not going to be as imminent as people seem to think it is.
I agree 100%. I mean, once the new SEC TV contract starts, I think it's estimated that every school is going to be making like $70 million per year from the TV contract, them and the Big Ten. So for Clemson or Florida State or Virginia Tech or whatever school to join a new league, let's say the SEC was open to expansion, you would have to show the SEC that you could bring in at least $70 million in TV revenue yourself.
Yeah, per school.
Per school, right. Otherwise,
and more than that, because you want to increase the TV package.
Because otherwise, everybody would make less. It would be more
mouths to feed.
More mouths to feed, exactly. So you have reached the point where these conferences are so big, and there's only so many time slots and things like that. Yeah. So I don't think there's that much more money to be made by adding to the existing conferences. I think if the ACC fell apart tomorrow, I think the more likely scenario is the Magnificent Seven, or whatever you want to call it, but stay together and pick up 2 schools and have their own 9-team league where they're playing an 8-team schedule that's pretty balanced, and there's fewer mouths to feed. Like, the overall revenue for that league wouldn't be great, but there's fewer mouths to feed. I don't know whether the per team payout would be more or less. You'd have to go to the networks and find that out. But I just don't think any of these teams would just snap their fingers and automatically end up in a bigger conference.
Well, I hate to say it, but how many RSN games did we play last year? We're not in that. Virginia Tech's not in that category right now where, there's a lot of teams above them that could make $70 million in TV revenue.
I don't know that there are.
I don't think there are.
I think Clemson.
Miami.
No, because the SEC's already got those states.
Well, this round of expansion, I don't think it's as much about geography as the previous one. Like, Maryland and Rutgers got in at the right time. They would not be invited in this round. But you look at who's moved so far: Texas and Oklahoma, 2 of the biggest brands in college football. USC, one of the biggest brands, and UCLA got to go along for the ride to give them a West Coast partner, essentially. Those big brands are, I think, what's driving this thing now. Because, what's the future of television and football? Is it going to be cable subscribers? I mean, cable's a dwindling business. Right. I mean, it's still there's a lot of money in it right now. They still make a lot of money on just eyeballs from having new states and getting new territory. So I don't want to diminish that fact, but look at where the industry is going right now in terms of streaming services and stuff. Can you imagine the SEC network streaming service? Like, who's going to pay over the top, for just a separate service that gets all those games? And if that's the case, do you care as much about geography, or do you care much about the best brands in football out there? If you add a Clemson and Florida State to it, potentially, I know those states are occupied already by other states, but those are two pretty big brands that a lot of people watch those games, no matter where they are.
And
would that be a bigger selling point for something like that? I'm thinking about what is the next step in television in college sports, and not necessarily what the previous step was.
Think about, I guess my argument would be, think about how many primetime games Clemson, Miami, Florida State play, even just the last 5 years compared to Virginia Tech. What do they get? One last year? We get one this year?
This 5-year period, yes. I mean, you're looking at Virginia Tech's at a 30-year low in terms of where its program is. I think these conference realignment decisions are made with a bigger picture in mind than just how you do on a year-to-year variance like that. It doesn't help that Virginia Tech isn't what it was. 10 years ago, they played one ACC title game in the last decade. Haven't won the ACC since 2010. I mean, it's been a while. It's not like...
It's like neither is Miami, though, right?
Right, neither is Miami, but, you look at the peak of those two programs. The peak of Virginia Tech's is played in the national championship game. The peak of Miami is won five national championships. They've made 2 or 3 30 for 30s about them. This is a program that moves the needle nationally. And when it's good, people will watch, and they'll watch in bunches. So that's why... we'll see. We'll see exactly. I'm skeptical that these leagues are necessarily pushing to expand in the first place. They've never, played with 16 teams as it is. Is that too big? Is that too unwieldy? I think it is, because 14 is. Yes, I think it's been a problem like that. You're going to split it up. You're not going to see teams on the other divisions or pods or however they break this stuff up for a long time. I'm wondering if they'd like to see a couple years of how does 16 work? Is this going to be a manageable number before they go, well, let's go to 20? And then 20 seems like, okay, well, you can split them up into 2 leagues, the SEC and the ACC. We're just getting back to what it used to be for some of these leagues. They're going to get so large and all-encompassing. So I think some of these places might just like to see how it works at 16 first.
I expect ESPN would want to see that too.
Yeah. ESPN doesn't want to be like, oh, let's tear up this this great contract we have the ACC to pay the SEC more. No, they're a bottom line industry too. So I can't imagine they want to do this whole thing. I mean, the only thing that could maybe drive it is this Fox and ESPN thing, and Fox trying to support the Big Ten and ESPN trying to support the SEC, but. I don't know. I just think that maybe they're putting the cart ahead of the horse in this whole thing right now, that it's maybe not as imminent as it seems like.
Last question on the matter. How irrelevant in this whole thing is men's basketball? Because you got to think a school like Carolina and Duke pushes the needle in men's basketball, completely irrelevant on the football side. And you got to think nobody's going to want them because men's basketball most of the time, Duke, Carolina might be the exception, breaks even or loses money. Football is what makes all the money. Correct me if I'm wrong.
It is. I wouldn't completely discount Carolina. That's a pretty strong brand. I know the football program hasn't been great, but you do have one of the premier basketball programs. You have the Jordan brand behind it. That has been a program that's been, I know they fell out of the top 10, but they have been pretty good here recently under Mac Brown last year, but played pretty well. So I don't think I necessarily discount that. It's just not the number one thing that they're looking for. If you're going to rank them, I think Clemson, just because of the football brand, is clearly ahead of them. I think North Carolina maybe could be second, though. Them and Florida State. I'm not counting Notre Dame. Notre Dame is everybody's dream scenario. They want them. I don't think Notre Dame's joining the conference regardless. I think football branding Clemson, just based on the national success that it's had, is so strong. And after that, I mean, do you say Florida State?
You're going to want, obviously, any conference or even a prospective new conference. If the ACC died, you're going to want state schools, right? So North Carolina is going to be one of those schools considered, not Duke. It's possible that, let's say the ACC fell apart tomorrow again and the Magnificent Seven broke away and then they added 2 new schools to make it 9. It's possible Duke could be one of those 2 if they wanted to keep the Carolina-Duke basketball rivalry alive. But Carolina would be everybody's choice above Duke, obviously, because they're a big state school.
I think NC State might be a choice above. I mean, NC State was included in that so-called group because that's another state school. That there are a lot of people that care about football. Gio, you asked about basketball. And I think the fact of the matter is basketball is important, but people care about football more, and football brings in more money.
And basketball doesn't make the money. Yeah.
Well, and I think there's a reason why you look at the ACC right now, right? Like a school like Louisville or a school like Syracuse or Duke, they care about basketball more than they care about football. And that's the bottom line, right? Those schools sell out probably. I don't know if Louisville and Syracuse necessarily sell out all their games, but they have so many fans at all those basketball games. But their football programs historically have not been, have not gone hand in hand with the basketball programs, so to speak, right? They're not they don't have these big giant fan bases that care so much about football, right? And if you're trying to bring in money, the schools like Florida State and North Carolina State and even Virginia and Virginia Tech, right? Virginia historically, in the past, Virginia was a good football program at once upon a time, right? And I think Virginia is probably hanging on by a thread there in terms of having a number of fans who care about football program that much. But they probably still rank higher than Duke or Louisville or Boston College or Syracuse or half of these other schools because of the size and just because of where the program has been historically.
Yeah, I think when it comes down to it, basketball money is the NCAA tournament. So as long as the NCAA tournament continues to happen and it's not going anywhere, then the basketball money, the money schools make from basketball, is going to be there. I just don't think it moves the needle all that much for television contracts. I think when it comes down to it, I mean, it might have been this way 15 years ago, but there's not going to be any gentlemen's agreements now. If Carolina feels like the best thing financially for them to sustain, not just their football program, but especially their basketball program, if that's not in the same league as Duke, I don't think they would tie themselves to Duke just for rivalry's sake and just for the tradition and things like that. They're going to do whatever they have to do to keep themselves relevant. And I think it's reached that point now.
This I mentioned this on a different radio show I did. This is like a prison break. Like you might work together with everybody to get out of the prison, but once you're over that wall, you scatter, and it's every man for himself at that point. And that's why I'm a little weary, I should say, of Virginia Tech spot in this whole thing. Like, don't be a means to an end to get Florida and Clemson State Florida State and Clemson to a bigger conference. Like, you don't want to do all this and then you end up in the Big 12 or something like that. So I would imagine, they've probably heard some stuff that perhaps they could get an SEC invitation if they were to get out of this whole thing. I think that would maybe some chatter that would even make them part of this group to begin with. But again, I'm just not so sure that these other conferences are so eager to expand this much this quickly. And if that's the case and you're not guaranteed a spot in that would make me a little bit nervous.
Right. And it's a moot point anyway, unless you can get around the grant of rights somehow.
Right. 13 years left on that. I mean, nobody's ever left more. I think Texas and Oklahoma are leaving a year early. Right. And they paid $100 million to get out of it.
Yeah. So Virginia Tech's athletic budget every year is $100 million.
Right.
Right. It's not happening.
Wow.
Yeah.
All right, Chris, you were across the pond hanging out over in England, so I wanted to get your thoughts. I know we talked about it with these guys, about everything with the transfer portal in specifics. Powell Ryland coming from Florida, adding a little bit off the edge for Virginia Tech. What does he mean to this team? And who else are they maybe targeting, if anybody else, out of the portal at this point?
He was a guy Tech almost landed out of high school. I think he would have been a great fit for Bud Foster's system. Not a very good fit for Justin Hamilton's system, and now I think he's a good fit for Brent Pry's system. He's a one-gap guy. He's not the biggest guy. If you want more size at defensive end, this isn't him. And maybe that played a little bit of a role in his transfer. Maybe Florida told him, you're not going to be an every down player, even though we did start the last 5 games for them. And he's a guy that you can't ask to go into a gap and then just stand there and hold up 2 blockers. He's the guy that has to attack and be aggressive and play with twitch, as Charlie Wiles would have put it, and just try to get into the backfield on every play. And that's how Virginia Tech will use him. I think you'd like to add a little bit of weight, but at the same time, his greatest strength is his athleticism and getting around the edge. So you've got to strike the right balance with that. I think he was Virginia Tech's most realistic option for finding a pass rusher in the portal. Now, I know if you look at his career stats, they're not all that impressive. But you look at his last 5 games last year, 3 sacks in the last 5 games and was dominant overall. And I forget, it was something like, I want to say he created over 20 pressures in those 5 games overall. So he was dominant. He dominated Florida State in that meeting, just straight up dominated them. So I think if you're looking for a pure pass rusher, he was the guy. Very excited about that pickup. There's one more offensive lineman. Apparently Clayton Frady was
from Gardner Webb.
From Gardner Webb, who's like an all Big South FCS All-American candidate type. I haven't completely done research on him yet. Apparently he visited Virginia Tech recently.
Yeah.
I briefly looked up his PFF scores. They were pretty good, although, against FBS competition, not as strong. But at the same time, I don't think PFF gets their most talented graders are not working FCS games, right? So I think at the very least he would be a depth guy. And I don't know whether he would be an offensive tackle or maybe he could play some interior line for Virginia Tech, but Virginia Tech needs some more experience. That they need some guys who can kind of bridge the gap between the older players and the younger players. Even if you brought in somebody who was just a backup, that can help. Because if you bring in a backup offensive tackle and Brent Pry's not happy with his right guard position, which he's not, then you could maybe move Brody Meadows to guard and give him a real shot at that position and see if he's their best option there. He did play a little bit of guard in the spring game, so I think they're kind of maybe thinking about making that move, but they want to feel better about their offensive tackle depth before they could make that move. At any rate, it gives you more depth and more options. So I don't know whether Virginia Tech will get him or not. I don't know where else he has visited, but that would make sense.
Last thing on football, speed round here for everybody. If you had to make like a player comp for what Virginia Tech's getting out of Power Island off the edge, who would kind of be your player comp? His play style. It could be historic Virginia Tech player or a non-Tech player.
He's undersized in terms of modern college football for a defensive end. He's what, 235, 240?
I can't remember what
I forget what he is.
I think he's like 233.
Okay, so like people think Tech's current defensive ends are small. Well, he's smaller. And I know he comes from Florida, so people are like, "Oh, we need more SEC talent. We need bigger players." Well, this is an SEC player who's smaller than Tech's current players.
6'3", 233.
Right. So people overrate size, particularly in Virginia Tech's scheme.
So is he like a Barno type of, or not as tall?
He's not that tall.
Yeah.
Barno had like
6'6"?
unique athleticism and space too. I think this guy is more of a down lineman,
straight
hand on the
speed
ground
rusher.
type.
Yeah.
He looks bulkier than Barno.
I mean, he might be a better version of CJ McCray, just in terms of like, he was moving from linebacker. I think they had him an outside linebacker at Florida, Power Island here. So maybe sort of similar in that sense. I don't know. I'm not a film comparison type guy.
Tap was big. He was 260.
What about Corey Moore? Big.
Don't even go there.
First of all, the first lesson is you can't commit like the number of like 5'8" and 5'9" defensive ends that try to pass off as the next Corey Moore. It's like, this guy's next Corey Moore. Nobody's the next Corey Moore. Okay,
there's never going to be a defensive end that short and that small who's that
wanted to rile you
that
up.
Short, that small, that fast, and that angry and pissed off all the time. Like that's a tough combination, and he's going to be a college. He's a college football Hall of Famer coming in. I mean, that's how much of a unicorn he was, being that size and that effective.
There's no such thing as the next Corey Moore.
Have you seen his interview the day before the national championship game?
Absolutely.
That is one of the funniest things I've ever seen.
God, imagine if that happened these days.
Oh, it would.
My favorite part of it is when he's cussing the reporters, and then Randy Keene comes up and he goes, "Oh, hey, how you doing, Randy?" right in the middle of it.
Now, having talked to some of the former SIDs, they've told me that he did that on purpose.
He did. He tried to take pressure off Vic.
Because Michael Vick was getting so much attention there that he, was trying to draw the attention away from him. Certainly did, at least for a day. With whatever that was. But that whole thing was hilarious. I bring it up every time that he's mentioned in terms of Hall of Fame. I'm like, oh, remember this clip on that? And, Randy King, slick back hair, walking out. Was like, what's up, man? How's it going?
Yeah, that's funny. All right. Anything else on football, boys?
I don't think so. We should be getting into
2 long months until the ACC kickoff, and
I know I got back from vacation and I felt like I should have stayed.
this is the
there's
part where
really
people
not,
are like,
still not much to talk about.
Right.
it's like, this is, oh, they got big recruiting camps. Like, you can't get me excited about recruiting camps. I just
can't.
don't care.
Nope.
All these guys are going to come in. It's like, are they signing? Because if they're not signing, I'm not really going to get that excited.
247 says Bob Schick's moving in, and you're like, who
Right.
cares?
Bob, I just, there's a lot of news, quote unquote news in the summer that gets trumped up where it's just like, there's not a lot going on. That's why we got to treat it like news.
With the transfer portal, so many decommitments these days and things like that, like keeping up with recruiting these high school kids at this time of year is less important than ever to me. Like I used to follow recruiting a lot. I still have to a certain extent because of my job. If I was a regular fan, I wouldn't follow it at all. Not until closer to the end.
I'm a reporter and I don't want to follow it at all. So,
Right.
yeah, of course, if I was a fan, I would not pay attention to any of this stuff.
It used to be Tech would offer about 50 guys per year and sign about 25 of them. Well, now you offer 300 of them because you've got these massive recruiting staffs and all the videos uploaded online. You don't have to go to their school to watch it. So you evaluate more guys, so you offer more guys, you end up recruiting more guys. So it's hard to keep up with. Like sometimes Jason Stame will send us a recruiting article for a guy that he's interviewed, and you'll get to the end of it, and I'll post it, and I'm like, that'll literally be the only time we ever mention this kid because he's one of 300 guys Tech has offered, right? So it's really hard to keep up with all the bodies, so to speak. But that's what having big, massive recruiting staffs have brought. Like, I don't think it's good for Virginia Tech. I'll be honest with you. Like, I think there's some good local prospects around the state this year that in the past would have gone to Virginia Tech, but now you've got these massive staffs with Huddle. So your Chris Coles, your Peyton Lewis's, Salem kids, the other linebacker, Brody Cahoon, committed to Notre Dame. Lewis is probably going to Alabama or Georgia, something like that. If there wasn't for these massive recruiting staffs these days, like those schools never would have heard of those kids from Salem, Virginia, right? So the bigger recruiting staffs get, like the harder it is. Yes, Tech adds James Johnson and things like that, but adding James Johnson isn't going to move the needle. I don't know where I'm going with that. There was a conversation on our boards this morning about big staff members and money, and the thing is, schools make so much money these days that they don't have anywhere else to spend it except on expanding their recruiting staffs, which just makes things even more difficult. Like the guys from this area that used to always come to Virginia Tech are now getting offered by Georgia and Alabama and things like that, and it just makes things a lot more difficult.
All right. Well, Andy and Chris Dave's got one more thing.
So I was just going back through and trying to think of defensive end comps. I think Daddy Nicholas might be a good
From a
comp.
size, undersized, yeah.
From a size perspective, he was 6'3", about 230.
230. That's what they said he was.
Well, that's what we have listed.
And
That's what he said.
that took a lot of work to get him there.
Yeah.
When he went from Wedley Esteem, how you pronounce
whatever
his name in high school, to Daddy Nicholas,
And
to
changed
Daddy
his name?
Alum Nicholas.
Yes.
By the time he was a senior, it was always a question of how much weight could he add, But it took a lot of doing, a lot of meals on campus to get him up to 230, quote unquote.
That senior year weight was probably like with his helmet on and shoulder pads and everything. Like, finally, Daddy, you made it.
He
230.
changed his name to Daddy.
No,
Daddy Nicholas.
He was originally from
Haiti.
He was from Haiti.
Okay.
Tech recruited him from South Florida. He was teammates with Luther Maddie.
Same high school. as
And
Del.
so
Delray Beach.
So he was when they recruited him, his name was Wedley Estime or Estime or whatever.
I'm not sure how to pronounce it.
And then suddenly, just like that, overnight, it became Daddy Nicholas. Like I don't know exactly how.
Interesting.
Yeah, but yeah, originally he was
Delray
on
Beach.
a
That's a top 5 name
Atlantic
in
High
Virginia
School in
Tech
Delray
history.
Beach.
yes, same as like Brandon Flowers and
Yeah, it's
David
very-
Clowney.
Very good high school to Virginia
Yes.
Tech over the years.
Cool. All right. Well, Andy and Chris will be around. We'll find some fun things to have them on set for this summer, no doubt. But we're going to turn the page here, get them off the set, bring on Chris Hirons, our baseball beat writer, and David Cunningham's going to hop on in one of the main chairs. We're going to talk a little bit of baseball, softball before we wrap things up. Welcome back to episode 298 of the Tech Sideline podcast. Today's show presented by First Bank and Trust Company, as well as Coldwell Banker. All right, David Cunningham on the set. We bring on our baseball beat writer, Chris Hirons, as well. Fellas, let's talk a little bit of softball first, then we're going to get into baseball talk as they get into their postseason action. First and foremost, softball. They end up falling in the regional final on the road against the Georgia Bulldogs. Tough outing for Virginia Tech late in postseason play, specifically against the Bulldogs. Maybe not the season that was expected coming in, but some positives considering they're number one in the country in home runs hit.
Yeah, I think it's tough, man. Will, who's back there producing, Will and I and Chris, we went to a lot of the games in Blacksburg last year in the NCAA tournament. That was fun, and I think after you're a team that's top 4 in the country, and Pete DeMoore has this machine going. I mean, this is a really, really good program. I think the expectations were a lot higher, which is kind of crazy to say because this is a team that went to a regional final, right? I think a lot of other sports at Virginia Tech, this would be a positive, and I think there might be some people looking at this as Virginia Tech only made the regional final. It came across a really, really good Georgia team who is top 5 in home runs hit in the country. I think Tech just at times this year struggled to kind of put the pitching and the hitting together at the same time. Like you said, Gio, one of the best hitting teams in the country. Hit 100 home runs over the course of the year. That's really, really impressive. New single season school record. But the problem is I think that there were times where they didn't get timely hits and the pitching just wasn't there at times. I thought it was really interesting what Pete DeMoore said. He told Chip Grubb, which was included in Chip's recap that I posted this morning. He essentially said, and I'm going to paraphrase, that this season was a little eye-opening for Pete DeMoore, and that he realized that you can't have one or two pitchers and just be dominant anymore. You have to have a staff, right? A little bit more like baseball, where you have to have multiple options. You look at, like he mentioned, a Florida State, right? You don't know what pitcher Florida State's going to throw, and as an opponent, that makes life really, really difficult. So I thought it was really, really interesting. Again, good year for Virginia Tech. I think people expected the Hokies to be a little bit better, but ranked, finished the season ranked for just about the entire year. Played well at times, played well in the ACC tournament. On Saturday night, played well against Boston University. It wasn't like Tech just didn't play well all weekend, but Georgia's really, really good.
All right, let's flip the script over to the baseball side of things. Get our man Chris Hirons involved. First and foremost, congrats on graduating, Chris.
Thanks for having me.
I remember when I was thinking about coming here, Chris was like one of the best guys to talk to because you had transferred originally from Syracuse. And I was thinking about going to either Syracuse or here. So can't thank you enough for everything you've done for me. And let's go get a softball win tonight in our intramural game. David's playing as well. But back to the baseball conversation. A tough pool here for Tech baseball. You got to play BC and Clemson, who are two very, very good teams. No doubt about it.
Yeah, I mean, a tough pool, but I think it could be worse. You could have Wake Forest in your pool, and you're kind of just like, maybe we're going home. But I think Clemson, Tech, at least during that Saturday game, proved that Clemson is beatable. Boston College, extremely beatable. They've kind of fallen off the past few weeks. They kind of had a lull in the middle of the season, but I mean, they were pretty beatable that weekend, and Tech kind of had a bad Saturday where they lost two close-ish games.
It was a doubleheader.
Yeah, it was a doubleheader. That's the thing. I mean, they dominated that Friday. I mean, they had Griffin Green, which they don't have this time around, but they had a bad Saturday. Maybe if they get that reset, you go back to, you lose that if it was a true weekend series where they're playing Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and there was that Saturday game, you're able to reset and going into Sunday. I think that's probably that's kind of the problem they ran into all year with Duke and with UNC, is that they never really had that true Sunday reset
because of doubleheaders.
Yep, doubleheader.
Yeah, I agree with Chris. I think it's not necessarily an easy pool because the ACC is really, really good conference and all these teams are really, really good. But it could be a lot more difficult. When Tech played Clemson that Friday game, and I covered that because Chris was graduating, Tech led through 5 innings, and then Tech gave up 8 runs in the 5th, and it all kind of became a big mess. Tech could have won Saturday or Sunday against Clemson. Clemson's not this unbeatable team. Really, really good. But I think if the Hokies continue to find ways to play good baseball, I don't think it's out of the question. Obviously, starts 11 a.m. on Tuesday morning. You play Boston College. You have to win that one. But again, Tech took care of BC on that Friday, and then just the weather in Blacksburg forced a doubleheader on Saturday, and Tech never really fared well during doubleheaders all year. So I don't think it's a good position. I don't think it's a bad position. I think it's kind of just you play the hand you're dealt, and I guess it could be worse. But I mean, again, this is a team that just knocked off number 1 Wake Forest on Saturday, and put up 14 runs on arguably the best pitching staff in the country.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
Tech is in a okay position right now, I think. We'll see what happens this week.
Yeah, I just want to, they've had times, Tech baseball has had times this season where they looked like they can beat any team in the country. I mean, obviously they proved that they could beat the number 1 team in the country on Sunday. And, through 5 innings in the Friday and Saturday game against Wake Forest, they were up. So, I mean, that's just the thing about Tech, is that they've been able to prove that, they really can compete and play with just about anyone in the country. And to do it with the injuries they've had, I mean, I think that's been kind of the most impressive thing this year.
Talking about the NCAA tournament conversation, you took a game from Wake Forest. Is it pretty much, though, at the point where you have to win the ACC tournament to get in? Or what are your thoughts on that, Chris?
I don't know. I mean, people have been asking me this all week in my replies. I'm not a bracketologist. I don't pretend to be. But I think for Tech to have a good shot to set itself up, going into Selection Monday, I think, they probably have to at least make the tournament final. And that means probably winning both of your pool play games plus winning the ACC semifinal. So, I mean, their backs are kind of against the wall, but, that's kind of the way it's been all season when they were 2-8 it was 2-8 in the ACC going to that UVA series. That's just kind of the way they've played all year. They play themselves into contention, and then the past 2 or 3 weekends haven't really gone their way, but they could have just kind of lied down and died on Sunday after, I guess, Saturday afternoon. But they came out and they played really, really well against Wake Forest, who arguably that's probably the closest pitching staff to a pro baseball team you'll see.
All encompassing after last year, diamond sports, softball, baseball. After the excitement of hosting a super regional on both teams last year, something that's so unprecedented to do, I think people got to remember that this year isn't necessarily a disappointment. Maybe it's a bring back to earth type of a year. What are your guys' thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree. I think especially for softball, I was talking about this with somebody the other day. I think with baseball, it's kind of a situation similar to maybe men's basketball. A lot of injuries. You don't have a lot of these injuries. Your team is completely different. Your outlook is completely different, right? Injuries are a part of the game, but if Jack Hurley or Chris Cannizzaro or Carson DiMartini, I mean, those are just 3 of the bats, are healthy all year.
Probably the 3 best bats, maybe up there.
That makes a little bit of a difference, right? Tech has a number of guys on the pitching staff that have been injured, have been hurt here or there, or some guys
they lost 2 guys for the rest of the year. They lost
Christian Worley
to Tommy John, and then they lost Griffin Green to an elbow injury.
Yeah, so just unlucky. I think with softball, it's more of a come down to earth moment, and like Pete Demore said, I think it's really, really interesting just to kind of look at it from a 1,000-foot perspective and go, what did we learn? I think with baseball, it's a little bit different because I think this is a very young team, parts of it, right? You just mentioned Garrett Michelle and Brody Donay are first team all freshmen.
Yeah.
For the ACC. So it's kind of a young team with some really good building blocks that will kind of help propel this team forward. I just think Tech's kind of got unlucky at times, right? It's hard to play a doubleheader. When you play Friday and then you play a doubleheader Saturday because the weather stinks. But I think again, NCAA tournament's not out of the question. It's going to be really, really difficult to do. If Tech gets out of the pool, it would play either Virginia or North Carolina or Georgia Tech. Beat Virginia, took the series from Virginia, and took the series from Georgia Tech too, right?
They swept them, yeah.
Swept Georgia Tech. Didn't beat North Carolina, but again, it's not out of the question. I think it's maybe a little bit of a disappointment, but again, when you play in one of the best conferences in the country, it's really hard to win games. It's really hard to win a game, let alone a series.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of look at this team and I'm kind of like, they're sort of that 2021 team. I mean, obviously they didn't have that fast start that 2021 team had, but you saw all those young guys. It was a younger Gavin Cross, it was a younger Tanner Schobel, and that kind of and they struggled that second half of the season. I think they went 1 or 2 11 or something over their last 13, 14 ACC games, but you kind of look at that team, it's kind of the same thing. You have a bunch of young guys, and this year with outgoing pitching, and then this year it's kind of the same thing. You have a bunch of young guys. You got Brady Donay, Garrett Michelle, Clay Grady. He looks like a Tanner Schobel, just with less power and a little more speed. And then you also have outgoing pitching, but you have promising arms and Griffin Stig, and you have Andrew Settlinger. So I don't know if I'd consider this year necessarily a disappointment. Obviously, I don't think Tech played the way they were expected to, but like you said, I mean, you missed 3 of your best bats for, a good chunk of the year, or they're not fully healthy when they're in the lineup. Like that's going to hurt. But you kind of look at this team and be like, okay, they have the steps to keep getting better next year. And assuming that, some of their best recruits come to Blacksburg instead of getting signed in the MLB draft, picked and then signed in the MLB draft, they have some really, really good building blocks for next year.
Yeah, I think what I would say is if this team was fully healthy all year and this was the outcome, it'd be a bit disappointing. But the fact that Tech's been hampered by injuries all year, and again, when you lose one of your 3 starters, I mean, the fact that Anthony Arguelles has come in and pitched as well as he's done, the fact that Tech beat Wake Forest this past weekend on a bullpen day, used 8 different arms. I mean, I think this team has shown it can compete with anybody. It's just lacked the consistency, and that's what happens when you're dealing with injuries.
No doubt. All right, Chris, last thing for you here. I know that some awards just came out as of recent news for Virginia Tech baseball. You want to name some names for us?
Yeah, so the Jack Hurley made the All-ACC first team, Carson DiMartini made the All-ACC third team, and then Garrett Michelle and Brody Donay both made the All-ACC freshman team. Wasn't surprised, really, by that news. I think Carson DiMartini, if he plays the rest of the season on a healthy shoulder, he probably makes the second team. But again, going back to the youth part, Garrett Michelle and Brody Donay, those are kind of your 2 offensive building blocks going to next year. I mean, the future does look pretty bright with them. You'll get DMart for another year next year. Jack will obviously probably go to the draft and then sign with a team. But, the team looks a lot better for next year rather than, it kind of did this year where it kind of ended bleak.
All right.
Yeah. And Hurley led the ACC in slugging percentage this year.
Yep.
There you go.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of talent there. Just sometimes, it's baseball, right? Sometimes it just doesn't go your way. And that's why I guess they play, 182 something in the MLB?
Yeah.
Yeah, they play a ton of games because, that 1 weekend doesn't define your season.
Right. All right. Well, thank you so much, guys. And again, we'll see you throughout this summer. Chris, best of luck, and we'll definitely see you around. Big softball game tonight. But the beautiful thing is it's not over yet for baseball, right? Still opportunities ahead of them. They're playing 2 top 25 teams in their pool coming up in the ACC tournament. So definitely be tuned in for that. That takes off 11 o'clock on
11
Tuesday.
a.m. Tuesday, and then Tech has Clemson at 7 p.m. on Wednesday.
There you go. And that's down in Durham, North Carolina, the home of the Durham Bulls. A nice AAA ballpark, cool spot for the ACC tournament. But that's going to do it for episode 298 of the Tech Sideline podcast. Thank you so much to our sponsors, First Bank and Trust Company, as well as Coldwell Bankers. For Chris Irons, for David Cunningham, for Andy Bitter, for Chris Coleman, for Will, I'm Giovanni Heater. We'll see you next time on the Tech Sideline podcast.